All right, let us start with prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, you are the Lord of nature, the Lord of life, and the Lord of death. Grant your Holy Spirit to us as we study your word this evening, so that our faith may be strengthened like those who heard you preach and teach while you walked this earth. Strengthen us so that we fear nothing in life or in death, and our faith is strengthened by your Spirit as we study your word. In your name we ask it. Amen. All right. This is our fourth chapter I'm calling it Preparing the Disciples. You'll see why as we work through the different sessions here. This is our first session, so we'll get going here with a bit of review. And the first question is about come on now. All right, here you go. About the centurion. How did he demonstrate his great faith, as Jesus called it? How did he demonstrate that?
First of all, he didn't want to stop one of his servants or whatever it was. And remember, secondly, maybe that, he knew he could just say whatever and it would be done.
Right, yeah. Yeah, he realized that Jesus didn't have to come to his house. He just needed to speak the word as he put it, and his servant would get better. So yeah, that's exactly how he demonstrated his faith. Luke, in his gospel, mentions that Jesus' heart went out to the widow in Nain. What does that mean? That his heart went out to her.
He had compassion for her.
Yes. And as we mentioned before, the original language here uses the image of the gut. We talk about a gut reaction or a gut-wrenching situation. That's where that idea comes from. Their thinking was that the intestines really were the seat of emotion. Okay, they had different ideas about different parts of the body, but that was one of them. So when we talked about that, that's what the original language is indicating. But yes, it basically means that he had a visceral compassion for the widow. Absolutely. John's disciples asked Jesus some questions. In answering those questions, what events did Jesus point to? There were certain events that Jesus mentioned to the disciples that showed he was the Messiah that was expected. Because that's basically the question they asked, right? Are you the one, the coming one? They said. You know what Jesus pointed to? Yes, they are mentioned, they were prophesied about in Isaiah, that's correct. Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61 mention some of the things that Jesus told those disciples that they were seeing fulfilled. What were some of those things that Jesus was doing? Exactly. Yeah. Talk about how the lame are being healed, the blind are receiving sight. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Understood. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that I'm referring to. And you mentioned the gospel being preached to the poor. Those are the kinds of things that Jesus pointed to. Jesus had been invited to the home of Simon the Pharisee, and the sinful woman was there. Can you contrast the two ways, or the ways in which those two individuals, the Pharisee and the woman, treated Jesus? Jesus himself kind of pointed to this as he was talking to Simon. Yes.
Whereas Simon, or the Pharisee didn't even offer water for washing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the woman washed Jesus' feet with her tears. Simon didn't even bother to offer water to wash his feet. Anything else that comes to mind? Jesus also mentioned that Simon didn't give him a kiss in greeting, but the woman kissed his feet, poured perfume on it. Simon didn't provide oil, which it would be a rather unusual thing for just a normal meal. All right. Why was the sinful woman moved to do what she did for Jesus? What was her motivation? Maybe it'd be another way to say that. Right, right. And Jesus makes that point that it's because of what she had been forgiven that moved her to do this. Forgiveness results in love. The Pharisees accused Jesus of using the power of Beelzebul or Beelzebub. Who is that? Right. That is that. At the time, it was a generic reference to Satan. That's correct, to the devil. Originally, it was an idol in the Old Testament. And then Jesus had something to say about relationships, especially relationships in the kingdom. What relationship did he say trumps even family ties? Exactly. Yeah. Jesus, remember, his mother and brothers had come to take charge of him. I thought he was a little off the deep end, apparently. And yes, he said, who keeps God's word, who obeys God's word. He said they are my mother and brother and sisters. We talked about, we have in several sessions now talked about different names that are used to refer to the Messiah. Can you think of any of those? Son of David, exactly. Yep. We're going to hear about that one again this week, today. Any others that come to mind?
The one who is coming.
That's right, the coming one. Yep. That's how John's disciples referred to or phrase that question. Are you the coming one? Yep. And there's one other one that's very common that Jesus used referring to himself. Remember? Might not sound like it's referring to the Messiah, but it really is, because it comes from the book of Daniel, a prophecy that the prophet Daniel made about the Messiah. It starts with the son of
God.
No.
Son of man.
Son of, oh good, well, son you're not. Yeah, you got it, Gloria. Son of man, right? Again, that sounds like it's emphasizing his human nature, and in a way it is, but it's a reference that Daniel made back in his prophecy to the Messiah, and Jesus used that a lot, referring to himself as the Son of Man. Yep, good. Any thoughts on any of those before we move on? All right. Tonight we're going to review the couple of the probably fairly common or well-known events in Jesus' life. Jesus calming the storm, Jairus's daughter, some other healings that go on. Now, as we're going to take a look at this, Jesus calming the storm, there's something I want you to take a look at first. Give you some pictures ahead of time. Back in 1986, there was a drought in Israel. And in the month of January, the waters in the Sea of Galilee were starting to recede, going down. And a couple of guys walking along the shoreline bumped into something with their foot, and they thought it was a nail, and they tried to pick it up, and it didn't come up real easily. And eventually they discovered it was attached to a piece of wood. And as they did a little more exploration, they discovered it was a boat. And they've also discovered that the boat was probably about 2,000 years old. It was sunk in the mud. What you're seeing there on the right side is that boat excavated, very painstakingly excavated, by the way. I won't go into all the details. Sometime you can ask me about it. It was amazing. It took years and years and years for them to get this out of the, well, they got out of the mud fairly quickly, but to restore it, and you can see it in the propped up there. The wood, of course, 2,000-year-old wood doesn't have a lot of strength anymore to it. So it's propped up there pretty well. But you can see kind of the scale by the people standing behind it. You can see about how big it was. Most of the boats, I understand, were about 27, 30 feet long, not much bigger than that. And then on the left side, you can see a model of what those boats would have looked like at Jesus' time. It's called the Jesus boat because it basically is from the first century. It's not necessarily a boat that Jesus used, but it's from that time. So I'm showing you that first because as we talk about the storm, it helps to understand what kind of boat we're talking about the disciples and Jesus were in. All right. So this is recorded, or versions of are recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let's have the table over there. Take Matthew, a table over here. Take Luke. Take a quick look at it. Well, let me ask you first of all, is doing it that way helpful? I realize that you're looking at Matthew and you're looking at Luke. You don't get the benefit of the other gospel there, but okay. Okay. If there's a better way, please let me know. But yeah, so take a look at those. Just quickly read through them a little bit and get a sense of what they say. And Donna and Gloria, you can pick whichever one you want. And I'll give you a minute, and I'll read from the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to spend most of the time in Mark. All right, so we're going to go with Mark chapter 4, I believe this is. Yep. And starting at verse 35, if you want to follow along in the gospel you were looking at, or in Mark, either one. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Other side meaning the east side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Any significant differences you notice?
In Matthew, it doesn't mention about the evening.
Okay.
Mark starts out with that day when evening came, but there's no reference to that in Matthew.
right? I think in Matthew, did you look at verse 18 in Matthew, by the way? Because that's part of that. It sort of leads into that event. What does that verse 18 say?
When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake.
So that tells us that that was the impetus or the reason why they across the lake, because the crowds were getting crowding around. All right, let's take a look at the some of the details here. We mentioned the crowd. Jesus had been teaching and healing a large crowd of people. And then Matthew also mentions that the disciples followed, and we need to distinguish again between three things, really: the crowd, the disciples, and the 12. So we've got the crowd. That was just a generic group of people there that had gathered. They may have been just curious. They may have heard Jesus before or seen miracles that he had done. Group of people. Then you've got the disciples, which would be what? Yeah, those who had been following him for some time, regular followers, would be disciples, more than just the 12. And then, of course, we've got the disciples, which we've referred to as apostles now, too. So those are the different groups we're talking about here. And yeah, there was more than just the 12 in this instance. And quite honestly, as I've thought about this event, as I taught it probably to grade school kids, I never thought or caught that there was more than just the 12 disciples we're referring to here.
Same thing, that's all through my young life. I always thought it was always just the 12.
But Luke mentions there were other, I think it was Luke who mentions there were other boats. So it wasn't just one boat. There were people in other boats following too. And then Luke mentioned, or Mark mentions rather, just as he was. They took Jesus just as he was. Well, yeah, he was exhausted, as we can tell in just in the next few verses here, because he had been working hard all day, preaching and teaching and so on. And so he is now sleeping in the stern of the boat. Then there's this interesting comment by Matthew. He says, suddenly. Now, I believe, I know the Greek does, and I believe the Hebrew is the same. They have a word which is an attention-getting word. And we're used to seeing it in the King James. It's that word, behold. Behold, the angel of the Lord, appeared to them, or whatever. It is a word we don't really use very much in English. I mean, we don't go around saying behold, but we do say things like, listen, I got a story to tell you. So it's that same idea. It's an attention-getting phrase, and Matthew uses the word here, which is translated simply suddenly. There was a storm that came up, and that's not unusual. The geography of the Sea of Galilee, and I'll show you a slide in just a moment here, is such that it's kind of in a bowl. It's, first of all, it's 700 feet below sea level, for one thing, and then it's also virtually surrounded by a lot of hills. So when cold air rushes down those hills, those steep hills, it can stir up that water pretty bad and get some pretty big waves. I've never seen that happen, or I didn't see that happen, but I understand it's not uncommon that it can. The waves are far more than you would expect on a fairly small lake. So anyway, okay. So moving on from there, and Jesus was sleeping, we mentioned before. The disciples, of course, are panicked. Notice he's tired, obviously, so he's sleeping, but he also has a perfect trust in his Father, just as his disciples should have in him. However, even though they're experienced fishermen, I can't beat them up too bad. God never promised, Jesus never promised that they were never going to face any danger in life. And this was probably a pretty dangerous thing if the boats were about to be swamped. They refer to being drowned. Don't you care if we're drowned? Even though they're professional fisher, at least some of them were professional fishermen, probably not all. And then Jesus calms the storm, as we just read, with a word. And I suggest here, compare that to creation. What do you think I'm getting at there? I say compare that to creation.
He could command with his word.
Exactly. What did he command with his word at creation?
Let there be light.
Exactly.
Be.
Yeah, with a word, he called things that were not into being. Exactly. And that same powerful word he uses here to calm the storm and control nature. Matthew uses the phrase "you of little faith." Luke and Mark, I believe, both have you still have no faith, or something to that effect. So he chides the disciples fairly mildly for their lack of faith. But like I said, they had, I guess, some reason to be afraid. I think it was only humanly natural, at least. And then the question, who is this? Now I would find that hard to believe it was just the 12 disciples, but remembering that there's other boats, other disciples following along, there's probably some people that were pretty shocked here by what they saw and heard. Not just the 12.
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
In Luke, Jesus said his disciples, so they got into a boat and set out. So from Luke, I get the impression there weren't other boats. They were all in this one boat.
Yep. And, you know, we don't know exactly whether, and I looked at this real super closely, but we don't know if Luke was just referring to the 12 when he said that. I'm not, and even then, I don't know if you get 12 men in that. Do you think you get 12 men in that boat we saw? Yeah? Pack them in? Okay.
A 26-foot boat, yeah.
Yeah, okay. You know more about boats than I do. So, okay. So it could have been that Luke is just referring to the 12. I don't know that I can answer that. But obviously, Mark indicates that there were more, that there were other disciples following as well. So we'll have to take both of those at their word. I don't think that's too big a conflict. What does that tell us about Jesus? This event,
He's in control.
Yeah. He's in control. We've seen him heal. We've seen him raise the dead. We've seen him control nature. And not only that, but it also points to the fact that not only is he all powerful, but that his sacrifice as the Son of God is all powerful too. It's all sufficient, maybe is the better way to say that, to remove all sin and guilt. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? All right, let's go on. First, a picture. This is from, I don't know, I wouldn't say we're quite at the middle of the Sea of Galilee there, but we're out a ways on a boat similar to the one over here you see on the left. And you can see the hills in the background there. We're looking out at the east side. So the direction that Jesus would have been coming and his disciples would have been coming from to travel back over to the Capernaum area, traveling toward us in this case. Yeah, so those steep hills there. Just as a point of interest, do you see the little white area along the foothills of the foot of the hills there off to the right? I could let you guess for a year and a half and you wouldn't guess what that is. Those are banana fields. They're covered with a tent, a huge, well, it's not really a tent, but there's a covering over them. That's why it looks white. They do that to control the humidity for the bananas. The area around the Sea of Galilee is a big agricultural area. Because it's so low, it has a subtropical climate. So they can raise a lot of stuff there, and they do. Israel tries to be as self-sufficient as possible as far as raising food. And agriculture is a big business. Okay, next section here, the 2 demon-possessed men. Now here again, we're going to notice a difference. So take a look. Let's just keep the same assignments here. Take Matthew, take Luke over here, and gals on Zoom. Pick whichever one you'd like. And I'm going to read from Mark. Okay, here's Mark's account, chapter 5, starting right at the beginning of the chapter. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. Now notice the footnote there, there's another spelling difference. It could actually be another city, but we'll talk about that in a minute. This is the east side now of the Sea of Galilee. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. All right. Some differences? Any that you want to mention? Matthew said it was 2. Right, that's the big difference here. Matthew mentions 2 demon-possessed men. Mark and Luke only mention 1. Is that a problem? let's put it this way, how could you justify that or reconcile that?
Eyewitnesses aren't always in conjunction with each other.
True. So how could you show that both stories could be still correct? What situation or what way of looking at it might address that?
Well, they said it was two, but only the one who was prominent in the talking.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So Mark and Luke just decided to focus on the one guy, even though there may have been two, or well, we know there were two because Matthew says there were two. But yeah, so one disciple says, or one writer says, there's two men. Okay, two men came. Well, like you said, one maybe did most of the talking, or whatever, or maybe Jesus just focused on. He healed them both, but he only focused on one. Yeah. Starting out with the area we were talking about here, the Gerasenes or Gadarenes is an area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. It comes from the town name of Gerasa or Gadara. I've heard an explanation both ways, that they're just different spellings of the same thing. I've also seen two different places with those names on a map. I don't know. I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of difference for what we're talking about here. And then, as you pointed out, Matthew does point to unclean, literally unclean, obviously meaning evil or demonic spirits. And notice how that gave these men superhuman strength. This guy that couldn't be chained any longer, he'd, tear the chains off and so on. The other mention here, before we get too far off of the geography here, the area of Decapolis is mentioned toward the end of this, but it relates to where these towns are. These are two of the towns as part of the Decapolis. Decapolis simply means 10 cities. Deca, polis, Decapolis, meaning 10 cities. They were mainly a Gentile federation of 10 semi-independent towns. The Romans had given them a little more independence than some of the other places in Galilee there, or in Judea, in the Palestine. So when we hear about the Decapolis, that's really what it was, just 10 towns. All right, now this guy, we're told, lived in the tombs. All right, to understand that, we need to understand a little bit more about Jewish burial or funeral practices. If we go back 2,000 years before Jesus' time, at Abraham's time, you might recall that Abraham purchased a piece of land with a cave in it to bury his family. Okay, that would have been common. Same thing was true at Jesus' time. Caves were used, but the real estate was a little more hard to come by at Jesus' time. Population was a little bit bigger. And so it was not unusual for a family to own a tomb or a cave where burial would be done. They didn't bury people in the ground like we do today. They were buried in caves, and usually those caves, especially Jesus' day, were carved out of a stone area, and there could have been multiple rooms within that cave where bodies could be laid. Oftentimes a niche or a little area would be carved out to create a shelf in the wall of the cave where the body would be laid. And then again, focusing on Jesus' time, typically the tomb would be closed up. So we're getting kind of a picture here that kind of leads us into Jesus' burial as we think about it later on. The tomb would be closed up. About a year later, assuming there were no other funerals, about a year later, they would come back. The body had been decomposed and only pretty much just bones lying there. Those bones would be gathered together then and put in an ossuary. Is that term familiar? It's basically a bone box. So stone box, and the bones would be placed in that box. And then that little shelf area would be open for the next person who died. Makes sense? Okay.
They still do that way?
No, actually, I don't have a picture of it, but actually they do bury them in, I still think they're above ground. I don't believe they're buried in the ground. Jewish cemeteries, you'll see basically little stone boxes. At least, you know, they're about as big as a coffin. Or maybe more like the, what do you call that other thing? The vault, you know, the vault they put the coffin in, about that size, and they're above ground, maybe standing up about this high above ground. The other interesting thing, as long as we're talking about that, is the common practice of the Jews is when you visit a grave, you put a stone on the grave. So you see the graves, you know, all these little stones laying on top of it, and that's the reason why. Anyway, remind me, I'll bring a picture. There's a big graveyard in Jerusalem, facing the old city. Interesting. Anyway, so this guy's living in the caves, basically, which are tombs in this area. Notice now that when we hear about these demon possessed people speaking, it's typically not them speaking, not the human victim speaking, it's this demon speaking, right? And when Jesus addresses them, he's not necessarily addressing the individual, the victim, he's addressing the demon, as he does here. So he addresses the demon and asks him his name. Now, remember I mentioned that one of the ways in which exorcisms were done was to call the demon by name. Now, of course, if you had a mute demon, you couldn't do that, which is what makes Jesus' healing of mute demonics a little more impressive, so to speak. But this demon does speak. He does tell Jesus his name, Legion. Well, legion could just mean many, but a Roman legion was typically several thousand men, anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 men. I mean, technically it was 6,000 because it was a group of not 6, 4, it'd be 100. I don't know. I'm not gonna bother doing the math. Anyway. The other thing we note here too is that many of these demons have not only superhuman strength, but superhuman knowledge too. They recognize Jesus immediately as the Son of God, as the Messiah. And we've seen before how Jesus tells them to be quiet. The other thing interesting about Luke, did you notice what the demon begs Jesus not to do in Luke?
Not to send them away.
Yeah, and he mentions a specific place.
Ephesus.
Yeah, the abyss. I believe how that's pronounced, the abyss. And that might ring a bell if you are familiar with the book of Revelation. It refers to hell as the abyss, the pit, so to speak. Yeah, so he says, don't send us into the abyss. Send us back to hell. They ask for permission to go into the pigs. And of course, Jesus gives them that permission. The pigs head off the cliff, drown. The herders go back to town and report what's going on here. And they come back and they want Jesus to leave. They don't want any trouble, Jesus. We can tell you there's something unusual going on here. Now, it seems that after Jesus heals this man, we're told he was fully healed because he was in his right mind. But the people of the town seem to be more concerned about their property, a herd of pigs, than they are about the miracle that Jesus does here by healing this man. Jesus instructs him to stay and witness how much the Lord has done for you. Oops. Oh, hang on here. Oop. Getting out of control. I'll make sure I didn't miss something. Any questions? Or thoughts? Okay. Let's take a look at the healing of Jairus's daughter and another woman too. All right, again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let's do it the same way. Okay, so here's Mark's account of that event, starting at verse 21 in Mark 5. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, so now which side are we on? We're on the west side now. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what was said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Any differences you notice?
In Matthew, Jesus turned and saw the woman that touched his cloak right away, but in the other two, he had to ask, who touched me?
Right. Right. And again, it depends on how the reporter, if I can use that expression, how the reporter reports what's happening. So does that mean that Matthew is disagreeing with the other two, that Jesus didn't ask the question? No, not necessarily. He may have asked the question and saw the woman. So that is a difference, absolutely. I guess what I'm trying to point out is a lot of these differences, and people will sometimes pick on them, really aren't that big a deal. In fact, they're hardly any bit of a deal when it comes to actually what the Bible teaches or tells us. They virtually are inconsequential. And as you pointed out, and we talked about before, witnesses that give the exact same story, word for word, are not probably the most trustworthy. There would probably be some suspicion to something like that. Anyway, okay, any other differences you know?
Like this condolences is more of a whole child that
Mm-hmm.
experienced something.
Yeah. The others are kind of a pretty generic version. All right, so let's dig into Mark here and see what else we can understand. All right, so we hear about Jairus. He's part of the crowd that meets Jesus now on the west side of the lake again. And he's a synagogue leader. The synagogues are managed locally, and maybe we should even just review a little bit. Where did these synagogues come from? I mentioned here that this had nothing to do with the priests. The priests, their job was at the temple, offering sacrifice and so on, doing all the stuff that was done at the temple. It had nothing to do with the synagogues. Why synagogues? Why were they even around? Yes, they did. The synagogues were a sort of church, if you could think of it that way, not unlike our own, where scriptures were read, prayers were said, psalms were sung or read, and not unusual to have a rabbi stand up and talk about one of the readings, sort of like our sermon. So they weren't too dissimilar from what we experience. In fact, I suspect that's why, part of the reason why our liturgy is the way it is today, because we kind of follow that same pattern that the early church followed. But why? Why synagogue? I mean, they had the temple. Temple was still standing. That's a trick question, sort of. I said still standing. There's a little more detail in that, right?
Or when people are even going into the synagogue, so they weren't able to go into the temple.
The men could go not into the temple, but they could go into the temple grounds, into the courtyard there, and bring the sacrifices and so on. Yes, they could. There was a time when they didn't have the temple. You remember when that was? Who built the temple? First temple. Solomon. Right. David prepared for it, Solomon built it. Then what happened to the temple? Stood for many years. That's exactly right. When the Babylonians came and attacked Jerusalem, after several attacks, when they attacked Jerusalem, the final time Jerusalem, the walls were torn down, much of the city was burned, and the temple was destroyed. Everything, it was totally cleared up. So there was no temple. And then they carried the people off into Babylon. And of course, there was no temple back in Jerusalem, and there obviously was no temple in Babylon. So there was no temple worship any longer. So that's where the synagogues got started. They at least used these synagogues, which could have been just somebody's home for originally, to continue reading the scriptures, Psalms, praying, and so on. That practice continued even after they rebuilt the temple when they came back. And it was still going on during Jesus' day. So that's the story of the synagogues. All right, so we've got a synagogue leader, one of the local guys in charge of the synagogue there, whatever, we're not told what town, I don't think. He comes and says, if you would only put your hands on her, she will live. Well, obviously, that's a word of faith. He does trust that Jesus can do this. Don't misunderstand him, that he's saying here, Jesus, you have to be there and put your hands on it. He may have heard that that's how he did it in other situations. It's not an imperative here that that's exactly what he's asking for. The other interesting thing is, you notice, what did Jairus do when he first met Jesus? This is kind of a very un-Jewish thing.
He fell at his feet
That's right.
and pleaded earnestly with him. Yeah.
Exactly. And Jews didn't normally do that, falling at somebody's feet. It would be an exceptional situation. And the reason for that was simply that falling at someone's feet is kind of tantamount to worshiping them. And the Jews didn't do that for understandable reasons. But this was a rather heart-wrenching situation for Jairus. His young daughter was at the point of death. But then we hear about this large crowd pressing around Jesus and this woman who is subject to bleeding. Now, I don't mean to be indelicate here, but I want to explain this clearly. Anybody know what's referred to when they're talking about she suffered from bleeding for 12 years? I don't know if you've heard this explanation before. The word that's used here implies a menstrual hemorrhage. She'd been bleeding in that sense for 12 years. Now, I want you to take this in, because first of all, a woman during her period would be ceremonially unclean. Intercourse with her was forbidden. This could have ended a marriage or prevented her from being married. So when it talks about her suffering, it's not just the physical suffering that would be involved here. She touches his cloak, immediately is healed, and Jesus confirms that this action is prompted by her faith. Why do you think he bothers to point her out? I mean, we don't know the answer to that question. It's more of a hypothetical.
To show her faith.
I think you're right. I think it's sort of a highlight, sort of like he did with the centurion and some of the others, to highlight her faith. And maybe to ease her. It seems that she had a bit of guilt there. When Jesus points her out, she comes trembling, you notice, and tells him what she had done, like it was a bad thing. And Jesus, I think, wants to calm her nerves, her fear. He even calls her daughter. Now, while he's dealing with the woman, these men come telling Jairus, your daughter's died. And Jesus' response is, just believe. Just believe. Nobody except the 3 disciples are allowed to follow. Now, we're told there was a crowd. Jesus dismisses the crowd, takes only 3 of the disciples with him. These are the same 3 disciples, of course, that see him transfigured, and the same 3 that he takes with him in Gethsemane. So these are special group of witnesses to these few events, these 3 events. Jesus refers to the little girl as sleeping, and to the Lord of death and life, death is but asleep. We're told he puts the mourners out. Now, these mourners, of course, are professional mourners. This was a very typical custom that when somebody died, could be neighbors, could be others who would come and help you grieve. They laugh at Jesus. They know death when they see it. And Mark records the words that Jesus speaks to the little girl in Aramaic, and he translates them for us. And then Luke tells us her spirit returned. She had died, so her spirit left her body, but Luke says her spirit returned. And immediately she stood up, got up, walked around. Later, Jesus tells the parents to give her something to eat. Another interesting little side note here. We talked about this woman with the bleeding situation. We've seen Jesus deal with lepers. We've seen him deal with other people who had died, just as a little girl. Think of the young man at Nain. Ceremonial law said that if you touch someone who was unclean, like a leper or this woman with the bleeding situation, you yourself would be unclean for a day. If you touch the dead body, you'd be unclean for a week. And then you have to go through this process of becoming ceremonially clean again. Doesn't bother Jesus. He doesn't pay any attention to that. Not because he's snubbing the law, but because he is changing the situation. You know, the leper is no longer leprous. The little girl is no longer dead. And or Jesus orders them not to tell anyone. Any idea why?
Was it like when he changed the water into wine, his time had not come? He didn't want people to follow him because of his miracles. He wanted them to come to faith.
Right. Yeah, that certainly could be. Obviously, we don't know the answer definitively, but yes, that makes as much sense as anything. We've seen Jesus do this now a number of times, tell people not to do anything. But you notice that Matthew says, it's spread all over the region anyway. So even though he tells them not to tell anybody, somebody talked. Somebody talked. Other comments or thoughts? All right, one last account here that we'll take a look at. This is a fairly brief one, and it's all from Matthew chapter 9, so we'll just go right there. Starting at verse 27. As Jesus went on from here, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." and their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over the region. While they were going out, a man who was demon possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. The crowd was amazed and said, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "It's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons." We've heard that right before. Son of David, there's that messianic reference again, as we've heard about it before. Again, taken from the Old Testament. Do you think Jesus was ignoring them by going inside? I mean, obviously he runs into them outside and then he goes into a house. Think of any reason why he might have done that? Again, we don't know the answer to that, but
More privacy.
yeah, could be the privacy aspect. I honestly hadn't thought about that, but that makes perfect sense since he's told them sternly, don't tell anybody about this. Well, that didn't work either, but nonetheless, yeah. Donna, what were you going to say?
Pretty much the same thing if you wanted to keep it quiet, to
Right.
go inside.
Yeah, makes sense. And as I said, Jesus warns them sternly. Could be the same reasons we've talked about. We don't know for sure. The demon-possessed man was made mute by the demon, and of course he's able to talk once Jesus drives that demon out. And the people say there's nothing like this we've ever seen in Israel, which is true. Remember we talked about the 3 miracles of the Messiah. We've seen 2 of them already, and I don't think we've talked about the man born blind that Jesus healed, but we've seen 2 of them. Several of them done some of them done several times, like casting out a mute demon. But in any case, the people are recognizing this, that this is unusual. I mean, this is not just some miracle worker. We've never seen this before. And yet, the Pharisees refuse to believe it, or the leaders. And it could be others. I don't want to pick on the Pharisees unfairly. There could be others too that refuse to believe, but we're not told specifically about them. Jesus already has debunked this idea that he's using Satan's power to cast out demons. That's silly. He's pointed out why. All right, any other comments or questions? All right, for next week, then we'll be reading, going through these events. And as I said, we're talking about Jesus preparing the 12, preparing his disciples to be his ambassadors, to go out and witness for him. And we too can take part in that as we know what Jesus has done. Thoughts, comments? Then have a blessed rest of your week. God's blessings on your study of his word.
Thanks, Dan.
You are welcome, Donna.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome, Gloria. I'll find my